In 1960, America's highways were changing. Diesel was rewriting the trucking industry. Cheaper to run, more efficient, the obvious future. So naturally, General Motors did something almost unbelievable. They built one of the largest gasoline truck engines ever put into regular production. A naturally aspirated 702 cubic inch V12, 11.5 liters. Nearly 1,500 pounds, with a forged crankshaft alone weighing close to 190 pounds, about as much as an entire small motorcycle engine. It wasn't built for speed. Despite 12 cylinders, it wasn't even built for horsepower. It was built to work, day after day, sometimes without shutting off for weeks, without complaint. So why would GM pour years and millions of dollars into a gasoline giant just as the industry was turning toward diesel? And if this engine was tough enough that some examples reportedly ran for decades, why did it vanish from production after only about 5 years? The answer isn't as simple as GM made a mistake. This engine wasn't born out of desperation. It was born out of one of the biggest transitions the American trucking industry ever went through. And to understand why it existed at all, we have to go back to an America still running almost entirely on gasoline, standing on the edge of a revolution it hadn't noticed yet. By the late 1950s, diesel engines from Cummins and Detroit Diesel were proving they could deliver huge torque on far less fuel. On paper, the future had already arrived, but reality was messier. Diesel trucks cost more up front. Small contractors and farmers who only needed real power seasonally couldn't justify the price. Repair shops across the country were built around gasoline. Carburetors, ignition timing, spark plugs, not compression ignition engines. And fire departments couldn't risk waiting on a cold diesel to warm up before racing to a call. Millions of customers still needed gasoline power. The challenge wasn't convincing them to switch. It was building a gasoline engine strong enough to compete with diesel until they were ready. GMC's engineers rejected the easy route of just enlarging an old V8. Instead, they started from a blank sheet, asking not, how much power can we make, but how much punishment can this survive? In 1960 came an all-new family of heavy-duty V6 engines, thick cylinder walls, oversized bearings, a 60-degree bank angle for rigidity. A year later, someone asked the obvious question, what if you doubled it? The result in 1961 was the Twin-Six, not two V6 bolted together, despite the myth, but its own massive cast iron block and a nearly 4-foot forged crankshaft riding on 7 main bearings. Sharing components with the V6 kept it serviceable at any dealership that already knew the smaller engine. Once assembled, the finished engine stretched nearly 5 feet front to rear. This wasn't just another truck engine. It was industrial machinery wearing an automotive badge. Peak horsepower arrived at a lazy 2,400 revolutions per minute. Unimpressive by today's standards. But that was never the point. Lower speeds meant less stress, longer bearing life, fewer breakdowns. It was engineering built for endurance, not excitement. And ironically, that conservative approach is exactly why so many Twin-Six engines survived decades of brutal service. They were rarely pushed anywhere near their limits. Officially, the Twin-Six made about 275 horsepower, modest even by 1960s standards. But at just 1,600 revolutions per minute, it produced roughly 630 pound-feet of torque, a number many modern engines never reach at all. Drivers said it felt less like a combustion engine and more like a giant electric motor. No frantic downshifts, just a deep, steady pull. It carried about 4 gallons of oil, more than triple a modern V8, constantly protecting a huge network of bearings under sustained heavy load. Its toughest tests weren't on highways. They were in fire departments, oil fields, and farmland across the American Southwest. Most emergency vehicles sit parked and silent for days, then need to start instantly and power water pumps at full capacity for hours. That demands two opposite personalities from the same machine, and the Twin-Six's smooth idle kept pump pressure steady even under sustained demand. For firefighters, that reliability could be the difference between saving a building and losing it. Farmers found the same advantage. Irrigation pumps across California, Arizona, and Texas ran almost nonstop through entire growing seasons, where reliability mattered more than fuel economy. Stories spread of Twin-Six pumps that seemed impossible to wear out, running for years on nothing but routine maintenance. That kind of longevity wasn't an accident. It was the direct result of engineers building everything stronger than it strictly needed to be. In many ways, the Twin-Six was over-engineered, and that's exactly why it earned such respect. But that same size and thirst for fuel would become the very thing that ended it. Through the early 1960s, diesel technology kept improving, more reliable, more refined, and far cheaper to run mile after mile. Fuel was often a fleet's single largest cost, and the Twin-Six's massive gasoline appetite simply couldn't compete. Its size didn't help either. The Twin-Six's weight demanded a stronger chassis, and its length ate up engine-based space fleets needed for payload, not power plant. And public confidence in diesel was rising fast. A decade earlier, buyers had approached it with caution, but by the mid-1960s, those doubts were fading. Dealer networks expanded, mechanics gained experience, parts became easy to find. The advantage gasoline once held was disappearing. By around 1965, production quietly wound down. For 1967, GMC replaced the Twin-Six with a smaller, lighter V8 built from the same architecture. In total, only about 5,000 Twin-Six engines were ever built, a fascinating footnote against the millions GM produced in that era. As old trucks were retired, many of these engines were simply scrapped, not because they'd failed, but because almost nobody wanted to rebuild such an unusual power plant. For decades, the Twin-Six quietly faded from memory. Then, in the early 2000s, custom car builder Randy Grubb, working with designer Michael Lead, flipped the usual hot rod formula. Instead of hiding the engine, make it the entire point of the car. The result was the Blastoline Special, later the Blastoline B702, a hand-built machine wrapped around a GMC Twin-Six that looked more like an aircraft engine than anything meant for the road. Crowds gathered everywhere it appeared, all asking the same question: what is that engine? The Twin-Six was famous again. That spark revived interest in the engine itself. Collectors began combing barns, scrapyards, and abandoned fire stations, often finding these V12s exactly where they'd been left decades earlier. Dusty, missing accessories, sometimes seized after years of sitting, but remarkably often still complete. Specialists like Thunder V12, run by engine builder Bob Walker, began rebuilding them from the ground up. Because GMC had deliberately engineered the Twin-Six for durability over performance, there turned out to be plenty of untapped potential. Modern machining and tuning have coaxed several hundred horsepower from an engine GM once rated at 275, while keeping the reliability that made it famous. It's easy to call the Twin-Six a commercial failure. It lasted only about 5 years in production. But that misses the point. A true failure doesn't earn restoration shops, museum exhibits, and collectors chasing it more than half a century later. The Twin-Six became unforgettable, proof of an era when engineers solved problems by building things stronger, not lighter, unafraid to build something that looked almost excessive. The market moved on, but the engine itself never really disappeared. It simply waited, in barns, inside retired fire trucks, beside silent irrigation pumps, for a new generation to discover what made it extraordinary. In the end, the GMC Twin-Six wasn't the engine that changed trucking. It was the engine that marked the end of an era, the last great giant of America's gasoline-powered workhorses. And sometimes the machines history leaves behind are the ones we remember the longest. If you enjoyed uncovering the story behind one of the most extraordinary engines GM ever built, subscribe. There are countless forgotten engineering legends still waiting to be rediscovered. Would you preserve a GMC Twin-Six exactly as it left the factory? Or build something outrageous around it, the way the pioneers who revived this forgotten giant did? Let me know in the comments. Until next time, Keep the stories alive.